Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silver Mont, and this is a spoiler-free review of Dark Souls 3. First up, a quick disclaimer, and if you want to skip that and get right into the review, click the annotation on screen now, or skip to the timecode in the description. I received a review copy of Dark Souls 3 on PlayStation 4 from Bandai Namco, but otherwise received no compensation, monetary or otherwise, for covering the game. I chose to cover it because, if you didn't know, I am a huge fan of the Souls series. As of time of writing, I have put over 30 hours into Dark Souls 3, and it took me around 24 hours to beat the main game, although that was missing out on a few optional areas and bosses. For the majority of my playthrough there was no online, so I won't be discussing online features. My history with the franchise? I've been a Souls fan since 2009, and have played every game in the series multiple times, so I'm fairly experienced with the series. However, I'll try and keep newcomers in mind with this review. Whilst I said spoiler free, that only means I will not be showing off any boss footage or any areas that are far into the game. The majority of the footage in this video will be from the first 3 to 4 areas of the game. So let's get started, shall we? Dark Souls 3 is supposedly the last game in the current Dark Souls series, the end of the trilogy, a turning point for the series. Where we go from here? We can't know. But I will be under the assumption that this is supposed to round off the story that began in Dark Souls 1. The basic plot of Dark Souls revolves around a world that houses a mighty flame. Only, this flame is fading, and it is your duty to kindle the fire, its fuel being the souls or life force of immensely powerful beings. The gameplay is a third-person action RPG, to which I feel a comparison with Ocarina of Time and the other 3D Zelda games is fair. You have a large world to explore, there are hundreds of weapons and armor pieces to find, stats to develop, spells to utilize, and so forth. And Dark Souls also has its own unique hooks, such as the death mechanics. When you die in Dark Souls, you do not get a game over or checkpoint. Instead, you are respawned at a nearby bonfire, and when you die, you will drop any souls, the currency of the game that is used both to buy items and level up your character. But if you return to the point where you died, you have one chance to recover these souls. The other unique features are asynchronous and traditional multiplayer aspects. Whilst exploring the world, you might find bloodstains that, when interacted with, will show you how another player died in their world, to give you a warning of what may lurk ahead. Other players are also able to write down messages in the game, to leave hints for each other, or to lead the unsuspecting into a trap. Beyond this, you are also able to summon other players temporarily into your world, or be summoned by them into theirs. And this will lead to jolly cooperation. But there are also world invasions that can take place, wherein another player forces their way into your world to hunt you down, offering a player versus player experience. And whilst there is a large PvP community, the emphasis of the games is clearly on the player versus enemy experience. Judging from prior games in the series though, you can expect the developers to release balance patches in response to certain items or spells being too powerful or glitched and so forth. Dark Souls 3 isn't strictly what you would call an open world game. The path is somewhat linear in that you will generally tackle areas one at a time in a set order. Although you do have wide freedom in those areas, and occasionally you will have a choice in which area to head to first. But this linearity is not a bad thing. It means that the game's difficulty is appropriately tuned. Contrast to, say, Demon's Souls back in 2009, or Dark Souls 2, wherein you are free to tackle almost any area in any order you pick. Whilst this freedom might sound good, it can cause a situation wherein the player tackles the challenging Valley of Defilement first, and by the time they return to the easier Boletarian Palace, they are so powerful that the game can put up virtually no resistance to them. Keeping some linearity ensures that the challenge scales with the player effectively. Of course, both types of game offer their own advantages, but I would say that this linear fashion is actually a good thing. And one of the key features that makes Dark Souls stand out so much is the level design. Whilst the areas are quite often geographically small compared to other games, they feel immense as they are densely packed with detail and little passages, not to mention clever shortcuts. Dark Souls 3 cannot boast that its game world is hundreds of thousands of miles, such as Just Cause and Elder Scrolls, but whilst those games are largely empty, if huge, Dark Souls is a densely packed, small area that does not feel small. Indeed, many of the areas really do feel massive in scope and scale, and some are genuinely breathtaking. I only wish I could show you what I mean. But I don't want to ruin the surprise for you. Needless to say, there are some vistas and sights in Dark Souls 3 that perfectly capture the series' haunting, cold beauty. On that note, what about the game's visuals and performance? To touch briefly on the latter, I was playing the PS4 version of the game, which runs at 1080p and targets 30 FPS. To me, I feel like it hit and maintained that frame rate for the majority of the time. I never ran into a Blight Town moment where the frame rate dropped immensely. That said, there were moments of slowdown. It's not that the frame rate dipped, but the game would run in slow motion for a brief period. If you are tech savvy, you probably know what I mean. Fortunately, this never really interfered with combat, as it usually happened when loading assets between areas, and it seems like they were clever enough to never put combat situations in those performance-heavy areas, such as transitioning between one area and another. Although there are one or two bosses who have so many special effects going on that you may briefly experience it. For me, it never hindered my enjoyment or experience with the game. I never went like, oh, the frame rate is, it's killing me here, it's getting killed, or it's messing up my timing. That was just my experience. I don't know how it's going to be for Xbox One or PC, but early reports suggest that the Xbox One version of the game runs at a slightly lower resolution and frame rate. Whereas the PS4 largely seems to hit 30, it appears that the Xbox One is quite often dipping down to 25. But if you want to know more about that, you should definitely check out Digital Foundry's articles, where they look into these things with much more depth and detail. But just from comparing screenshots of the Xbox One and PS4 version, or comparing side-by-side footage, they look largely identical for the most part. They are visually on par. Texture quality, terrain quality, environment scaling, level of detail, all that stuff, although PS4 seems to have a slight advantage in shadows. I cannot speak for the PC version at time of writing, but I imagine that will definitely offer the smoothest experience, if your PC is powerful enough, of course. Both console versions suffer from slight pop-in if you are running through areas quickly, but for the most part, the game performs well, and I expect patches will only improve it as time goes by. As for the visuals, the game resembles Bloodborne quite heavily, as it uses the same engine. This means that graphical features in Bloodborne are here too. Excellent cloth physics and bloodstains and splashes on and around your character. It isn't the most graphically astonishing game in the world, but the art style more than makes up for it. For the Souls series has always had amazing art direction. Even if they've suffered from performance issues or outdated graphics and technology, the art style makes up for it in a huge way. Dark Souls 3 is no different. If you see an ominous fortress looming in the distance, Gothic architecture dominating the landscape, you can be almost assured that in a few hours you'll either be exploring its dark dungeons, drafty halls, or even scrambling along its towers and buttresses. And if there's one thing the designers in Dark Souls love, it's buttresses. Of course, it isn't perfect. If you really look for it, you will find bizarre elements like floating trees or ugly textures, but that doesn't take away from the level of detail and care that goes into these environments. So whilst the game engine isn't the most amazing in the world, the art style more than makes up for it. Because Dark Souls 3 is a beautiful looking game. Likewise, whilst the player models themselves are somewhat ugly and humans look kind of dated, the armour and weapons are handled with at least as much care as the environments. Armour gleams with a muted sheen when drenched in blood, and weapons feature intricate details along the blades. And speaking of weapons, you'll find dozens of them. From long swords to axes to spears to bows to giant clubs. You'll find many items returning from prior Souls games, including a few you really are not going to expect, but also plenty of new ones. There's a huge variety here too, ensuring that everyone has the capability to come across as unique and let their character shine through. Oh, and did I mention, armour cannot be upgraded in Dark Souls 3, and up to 70% equip burden is fast rolling, so you're free to go mad with your fashion souls. And whilst human characters look kind of ugly and dated when you look at their faces, the monsters and beasts look as good as you would expect from a Dark Souls game, which is great. That covers the visuals. How about the sound design? Whilst you will hear a lot of reused assets such as weapon clangs and footsteps, whether or not that's a problem is up to you. Dark Souls 3 uses sound effectively. The ragged breathing of monsters is always a good indication that something is lurking up ahead. Music is used sparingly and almost exclusively for boss fights, wherein every boss has that one feature that I like to call the revengeance effect, of having one track that subtly transitions into another when the boss enters their second phase. And I know Metal Gear Revengeance wasn't the first game to do that, it's just the one I associated with. Oh, and did I mention, every boss in Dark Souls 3 has multiple phases. And the bosses are a very important part of Dark Souls. There are less bosses in Dark Souls 3 than in Dark Souls 2, but there is more variety and care put into each one. None of the bosses frustrated me to the extent that Amelia and Paul did in Bloodborne, and I still stand by my belief that those two bosses, Amelia and Paul, are poorly designed. If you've played the DLC in Bloodborne, that will probably give you an idea of what to expect from the bosses in Dark Souls 3. They intensify as the fight progresses. Some will make you shout, some will make you swear, but the majority of them are fun to look at and fun to fight. Which, of course, leads into another subject: difficulty. Dark Souls has a reputation as being super difficult, a super hardcore, punishing game. Personally, I do not believe the series deserves that reputation, and I also believe that reputation scares off people who would otherwise go into Dark Souls. The games do not hold your hand, they do not walk you through every little challenge and pat you on the back. They are not easy games. The games will punish you if you are careless, but they will reward you if you are careful and put time and thought into things. But are they incredibly difficult? Of course, that would depend on your skill as a player, and if you care about it, I have a video exclusively devoted to this difficulty subject. But personally, I don't think Dark Souls is so hard that it should put people off getting into the game. I didn't have very much trouble with Dark Souls 3, but then I've played every Souls game and I am somewhat competent at them. If you're getting into this game looking for a crazy challenge, then I suggest you either temper your expectations or try and set yourself a challenge. I would say it is markedly easier than Bloodborne. Does that mean the game is dumbed down or too easy? No, the difficulty felt just right to me. But this is a very subjective matter. If you play Dark Souls for the difficulty, then maybe you'll be disappointed. How you play, how skilled you are, these things all play into it. I will say that Dark Souls 3 did not, so far as I can recall, give me any cheap deaths that felt unavoidable or stupid, such as the floor suddenly collapsing beneath my feet for an instant death with no warning that the floor might be unstable, for example. Almost every trap and danger I saw in Dark Souls 3 could be avoided, if you took the time to plan out your route. And you know, I think that's just how it should be. And I felt the bosses were about right too. They were definitely harder than Dark Souls 1 bosses, probably harder than Dark Souls 2 bosses, but somewhat easier than Bloodborne bosses, for the most part anyway. But of course, in Bloodborne, you had no shield. So is there anything bad about Dark Souls 3? It is hard to think of objective criticism for the game. A lot of the complaints will be largely subjective or very personal. The issue of reused assets, the game not running at 60 frames per second and so forth. The only real problems I have with Dark Souls 3 are a few specific enemies. There are 3 enemies in the game that annoy me, but fortunately they're not very common. But it is entirely possible I just didn't figure out a good trick to fighting them properly. After all, a large part of Dark Souls is the community aspect. Players talking to each other, sharing their tactics. Did you know there's a hidden item over here? Did you know that this enemy or this boss is weak to this or that, you know? I didn't have that because I wasn't talking to anyone because I was playing before the game came out, you know? There was no online, there was no community there. So it's entirely possible I was just being stupid. Beyond that, I don't really like the weapon art mechanic. I don't really understand the point of it. I get it working for spells, but for a lot of weapons it's like, okay, I can do a slightly different attack that I can do a limited number of times, or I can just do this other attack, which is essentially just as good, but I can do it an infinite number of times. It's a little bizarre to me, but I feel like this is something that as the game matures, I'm sure weapon arts will find their place in the game, in the meta. Although I think some balancing definitely needs to occur there. Beyond that, I found the ending of Dark Souls 3 a little disappointing. I said at the start of this review that I was operating under the assumption that this is the last Dark Souls game that is supposed to wrap up the story of the trilogy. Well, I don't feel like the ending does, and yes, there are multiple endings. They aren't terrible endings, but as for wrapping up the trilogy, I'm not sure on that. DLC is coming for Dark Souls 3, though. Is it going to expand upon the ending like the Dark Souls 2 Scholar Edition or like the Bloodborne DLC? I guess we'll have to wait and see. The ending wasn't bad, I should say again, but it was a little disappointing. I was expecting more, personally, especially after Scholar of the First Sin. In every other way, though, I think Dark Souls 3 lived up to my expectations, and at times exceeded them. But that does raise another issue. There is quite a lot of what you might consider fan service in Dark Souls 3. Whether or not you think that's a problem is once again entirely subjective. Beyond that, there's the DLC. I know some people are upset that they announced a season pass before the game came out, but it doesn't feel like the game is missing content to me. Even the endings, although they're disappointing, it doesn't feel like they've taken out like another ending to keep it as DLC, you know? It doesn't feel like they've cut stuff out to sell it back to us as DLC. I don't think that's the case. Do I know that's the case? No. But it does feel like a complete game, and personally I have no problem with DLC that is done right. And I feel like the Souls series has to date nailed the DLC. But again, that is entirely up to you to decide. Is Dark Souls 3 good? Yes. Is it worth the asking price? Yes. Is it as good as the first Dark Souls? Too early to say, but it's a damn good game. I'd say it's better than both Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne. And I look forwards to summoning or being summoned by you guys in Lothric. I hope this review was hopeful or entertaining. And until next time, you guys take care.
Long may the sun shine!